Was asleep in seat 8A, his head bobbing against the window like a man trying to keep his balance on a boat he once knew how to steer, when the captain's voice, calm, practiced, threaded with an urgency that made everyone in the cabin straighten, cut through the hum of the engines and the murmur of 100 small anxieties. "Is there a combat pilot on board?" it asked, and for a single, breathless second the ordinary world rearranged itself around those words. The magazine falling from an old woman's lap, a toddler's lullaby breaking off mid-gurgle, the fluorescent lights sharpening as if to focus on the aisle between rows 7 and 9. Daniel Cooper woke with his mouth dry and the taste of sleep still on his tongue. The child curled beside him, breathing shallowly, and for a sliver of time he feared it was only another bad dream, until every head turned to him with that same question waiting in their eyes. Daniel had not been to war in a long time, and the uniform he kept folded at the back of his closet belonged to a life he had boxed up carefully the year the cancer took his wife. He had been a combat pilot once, not for the thrill, but for the promise of coming home, irony that had always been crueler than the missions. After Anna died, the skis had emptied. He sold his flight gear and took a job in night shifts at a factory to keep the bills from piling up, to keep his son Ben in school, to keep his hands busy so they wouldn't reach for the bottle. Still, the muscles remembered. The reflexes that had kept him alive in a metal bird above a foreign land had become a quiet tremor at the base of his palms. He had learned to be a father in the same stern, patient way he had learned to fly. Checklists, small kindnesses at precise moments, promises made and kept. On that flight, a midwinter run from Atlanta to Charlotte, purchased with the last of a postponed anniversary fund because Ben had begged to see his grandmother, Daniel had slept with his son's head against his shoulder, Ben's soft, hopeful face the only map he trusted anymore. When the flight attendant's voice asked again, more urgently now, a woman in the front row rose, her face the pale, focused concentration of a nurse. A man in a suit crossed the aisle and offered his hands for a child to be carried, while Captain Reynolds, whose voice sounded like every safety announcement he'd ever heard but steadier, stepped back through the curtain with the co-pilot, Sarah Miller, at his elbow. Sarah's hands were steady at her sides, but her jaw was hard. She was young, very young to be a first officer, and the way she glanced toward the cockpit suggested something inside had gone wrong, and the practice script that kept them all calm had frayed at one edge. "We have an issue with the autopilot," she said, voice low enough not to alarm the passengers but high enough for the cabin crew to catch the wire of fear in it. "Mechanical. We'll need a trained hand in the cockpit for a manual approach if the ground crew can't get us guidance." Those words landed on Daniel like a physical thing. A manual approach. No matter how many meditations or therapists told him to stay away from the pull of the past, the problem laid itself bare. If the captain needed a pilot who had seen combat, who had flown without instruments and under pressure, it might be him they needed. The plane felt suddenly too narrow, as if the air between the rows had compressed around Ben's small frame, and the sound of the engines had filled with judgment. Daniel wiped his palms on his jeans, feeling the faint memory of cold cockpit metal. He had promised Anna he would never get on a plane to risk everything again. She had been the one who taught him the arithmetic of fear and love. But he had promised Ben different things too: Christmases and baseball games, a grandmother's stories, a future not anchored by grief. The two promises collided in one bright, terrible clarity. He stood up slowly, the cabin watching him as if waiting for a confession. Ben rubbed his eyes and blinked sleep away, looking up at his father with the uncomplicated trust of a child who had once believed that his dad could fix anything that broke. "Daddy," Ben's small voice was a tether. Daniel forced a smile. "I'll be right back, bud. Hold on to your toy." The toy was a battered wooden airplane Anna had carved for Ben the year he was born. It felt heavier than it ought to as he tucked it under Ben's chin and kissed his forehead. Walking toward the cockpit felt like passing through a history of himself. Medals, memories, the smell of jet fuel and hospital antiseptic, the echo of sirens that had once followed him home. Captain Reynolds met him halfway, eyes the precise gray of someone who'd swapped adrenaline for protocol and never lost the habit of measuring risk. "Mr. Cooper," the captain said. He didn't say sir like a salute, he said the name like an offer. "We've got partial failure on autopilot and one of the radio beacons is offline. We can follow vectors visually, but visibility's patchy around the approach corridor. If you have experience on manual approaches in degraded systems." He let the sentence finish without imposing it. Daniel said, "I do," and felt the old engine inside his chest rumble awake. Sarah ran her fingers through her hair, an uncharacteristic sign of vulnerability, and offered a quick, grateful nod. "We'd appreciate any help," she said. In the cramped cockpit, the past returned like a flood of faces and lessons. Daniel's hands remembered the feel of the yoke in a way his brain could not have taught the fine pressure to correct, the correction that morphed into muscle memory even when his mind protested. The co-pilot briefed him on systems in clipped, practical tones and pointed out where the instrument panel read wrong. Outside, the winter sky was a gray bruise, patched by bands of cloud that the ground tower could not penetrate. The radio stuttered like a heart skipping beats. "We will have to do this visually then," Captain Reynolds said, and the word "we" felt more like a binding than a pronoun. Back in the cabin, tensions braided tight like a rope. Ben, under the careful watch of flight attendants who smelled faintly of lemon and starch, clutched his wooden airplane and watched his father through the curtain as if seeing him for the first time. Around them, strangers tried to carry on with magazines and quiet games, but the hush of people holding their breaths was part of the aircraft's atmosphere now. To Daniel, every face was an unasked-for census of hope. Elderly couples bound for a funeral, a young woman with a guitar case whose hands trembled with more than nerves, a businessman whose wedding band glinted with indifference. He could not know their names, but he knew the language of fear and the contravention of it. Steady voice, clear commands, small acts of reassurance. He told the flight attendants nothing about his own history because he didn't need to. His steadying came from the same place the crew relied on, from ritual, from training, from the sense that panic diluted competence. The descent was the kind of crucible that strips away pretense. Without the autopilot with intermittent radio, the plane nosed down under a sky that occluded the runway like a palm hiding a coin. Instruments lagged, crosswinds chewed at their approach like teeth. Daniel's jaw ached with concentration. He spoke out loud in short surgical sentences, and the pilots and attendants repeated them back like a chorus learning to walk again. "Keep the airspeed 90. Flaps 2. Trim at neutral. Expect gusting from left to right." Hands moved with the choreography of people who have rehearsed survival 1,000 times. There was a moment when the runway glowed, and then didn't, when their attempted heading was bent by a gust, and the plane slid like a skater testing an unfamiliar rink. A different man might have tensed, might have let the memory of loss freeze his fingers. Daniel felt something else, not bravery as movies define it, but a quiet, honest refusal to fail the child at his side and the strangers in other people's worlds. As the ground rushed up, a sound rose from the cabin that Daniel had not expected, a collective intake of both fear and faith. Ben dug his fingernails into his father's hand, forgetting the toy, and Daniel felt the grip like an anchor. The wheels kissed concrete and the plane shuddered, then held. The landing was not flawless. It was a poem written by people who had been afraid and had chosen to work through that fear with the tools they had. Outside, emergency crews bristled with flash of lights and the pragmatic rustle of readiness, but no doors flew open with panic. Captain Reynolds' voice, when it came over the intercom, was tired but softer. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We'll be on the ground for a short time while we coordinate technical assistance. We appreciate your cooperation." His pause gave thanks to a set of passengers who had braced and come through, and somewhere behind that announcement was a current of gratitude that looped toward a man on hold in seat 8A. In the sterile brightness of the terminal, debriefs and handshakes followed. Mechanics were thorough. The airline offered accommodations and a transfer, and the passengers murmured about the miracle of a safe landing. But for Daniel, the true consequence of that cramped, tense hour unfolded privately, in the small ways that life rewrites itself after being tested. Ben pressed his face into his father's chest and cried for reasons a child cannot name, half relief and half release. On the sidewalk outside the terminal, under a sky where winter had thinned and allowed a cold, hard blue, the two of them stood wrapped in borrowed blankets while a volunteer handed out hot drinks. "You were good," Ben whispered, small fingers tracing the line of a scar scarred on his father's knuckles, evidence of a life that had been braver and more broken than he had ever imagined. Daniel felt the old shame and the new pride tangling together like threads of different colors. He had been afraid he would become the man who could not hold a life together after losing Anna, but in the underside of that fear lived a thread of purpose he had not expected to find. The realization that his combat experience did not only belong to a past he had survived, it could be a bridge to a future he had not planned. Night found them home, the house smelling of dinner and the small, stubborn domesticity Anna had left as a through line. Ben fell asleep that night with the wooden airplane tucked under his arm and his breath even and soft, and Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold. He thought of the faces on the flight, of Captain Reynolds' steady courage, of Sarah's young, hard-earned professionalism, and he allowed himself to imagine something he had never given room to dream: purpose without violent ends, a life where his hands could steady more than his son, where they could teach and train, where he could volunteer at the local flight simulator club, where he might help other veterans find ways to use their skills in peaceful service. That night he called the Aviation Museum, not to ask for one more flight, but to ask if they had volunteer programs that welcomed people with flight experience to mentor youth. The voice on the other end was surprised and then warm. Someone there remembered his name from a fundraiser years before and asked him to come by. The weeks that followed held small reckonings and larger adjustments. Daniel went to a meeting at the Aviation Museum and found himself surrounded by teenagers with hands stained by oil and eyes bright with the same hunger that had first led him to fly. He taught them about checklists and humility, about how you respect metal and each other in the sky. Ben watched his father through school plays and soccer tryouts with an expression that showed he was learning who his father was in a new language, less mythic soldier, more reliable anchor. Daniel sought counseling again, not because the past was prosecuting him, but because he wanted the future to include more than the pale footprints grief had left. He learned to name the moments when memory felt like drowning, and to ask for help before it overwhelmed him. In small, practical ways he repaired the life Anna had left. Bills paid on time, a garden resuscitated, a thermostat kept at a temperature that made winter tolerable. The plane landing had not erased his sorrow, it had simply rearranged it into something serviceable. Months later, the airline sent a letter thanking the passengers for their cooperation during that flight and extending an invitation for a meet and greet with the crew. Daniel hesitated, then accepted. In the crowded room, Captain Reynolds found him and clasped his hand like a comrade. "You saved us all a lot of trouble," the captain said, and Daniel felt the weight of that sentence settle into something like permission to take pride without guilt. Sarah, the co-pilot, confided that night over coffee that she had followed her father into aviation because she wanted to prove she could handle a plane and a life. She told Daniel her father had died 2 years back, and that flying had both been her rebellion and her comfort. In the exchange of stories, Daniel found a network of small sagas, people who had been broken, and had chosen to use the edges left to build bridges for others. He began to volunteer with a veterans group that taught skills in civilian settings, to help men and women transfer the discipline of war into the discipline of community service. On a bright spring morning a year from that flight, Daniel walked Ben to a small airfield where a group of teenagers were assembling model planes. Ben's face shone the way it had when he was little and new to wonder. "Daddy," Ben said, "will you show me how to fly one?" Daniel knelt and took the small controller into his calloused hands, feeling the same careful math he had always used: throttle, trim, patience. He didn't tell Ben about the time he had closed his eyes in a cockpit and prayed for a landing that would bring him home. He didn't need to. What mattered was the gesture that followed, the lesson that fear could be an instrument if you let it be, that skills honed in hardship could be repurposed into gentleness. He taught Ben to read the sky like a friend and to respect it like family. The flight that had woken him in seat 8A became, over the months and years, a hinge in his life. It didn't fix everything, the ache for Anna never fully dissipated, but it offered a map back to himself. Daniel learned that bravery was not an absence of fear, but a choreography of choosing who and what to be afraid for. In small, practical acts, volunteering, mentoring, listening to the quiet panic of another veteran, and answering with a phone call instead of platitudes, he translated the muscle memory of combat into the daily, more sacred work of keeping a life aloft. And when Ben, older now, stood at his high school window watching a small plane cut across the late afternoon like a neat, steady stroke, he turned to his father and said, "You saved people that day, not just on the plane." Daniel looked at him, felt the full, complicated swell of sorrow and pride, and answered simply as he'd learned to do, "We saved them together." The story of a single dad asleep in seat 8A who woke to a captain's call is, in the end, less about the thunder of engines and more about the quieter reckonings that follow danger. It is about a man who learned that the promises he makes to the living matter as much as the vows he kept to the dead. It is about a son who learned what courage looks like when it is patient, and a community that chose trust over panic. In the long arc of his life, Daniel found that the sky did not always demand sacrifice. Sometimes it offered a way back, if only one was willing to step forward, steady hands and a softened heart ready to help carry others through the